Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reading Tolkien podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Holly Ordway, who is the Cardinal Francis George Fellow of Faith and Culture for the Word on Fire Institute. And Holly, I believe that's the organisation associated with Bishop Barron. Am I right there?
Yes.
Right. Yes. Because I've seen a few of his YouTube videos. He seems to have a bit of a presence there, which is interesting. So Holly, of course, is the author of Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages, which is a wonderful new book that's just been published by the new press out of Word on Fire Institute, or the academic section of their press. And that's the first volume out of the academic side of the press, and more will be coming. And so, Holly, look, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's a great pleasure to talk to you, actually, because it's such a wonderful book, and I've really enjoyed reading it. Just to start off, at any rate, yeah.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure, and of course, that's music to my ears as the author to hear that people are enjoying the book. So we're off to a very good start.
Yes, no, I've really enjoyed it, and we'll get into obviously a couple of issues that you raise in the book. But I think it's a corrective in some ways to a number of shibboleths, perhaps, that have been had by Tolkien scholars, perhaps, and also fans for a while. So I think in that sense, as in quite a few others, it's very important. So one question I like to start off with when I'm talking to Tolkien scholars, is just a very general question of where do you see Tolkien studies as a field, if you want to call it that, generally, and where do you think it's going in the right direction? Or, again, broad question, but I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I think that Tolkien Studies is in a very exciting place. I think it's opening up in some pretty dynamic directions, and this is really neat to see. And coming to Tolkien Studies also from my grounding is also in Inkling Studies, broadly speaking. I'm a subject editor for the Journal of Inkling Studies. I've done work on Lewis. And it's interesting to see the way that the different Inklings, that their scholarship has sort of opened up at different times and in different places and in different ways. And I think that for a while, Tolkien scholarship, I think, didn't quite have much traction in academia. Had a lot of enthusiasm for the first few decades from readers, but had to be always pushing against that idea of from the larger culture of, well, fantasy, that's not really a terribly important thing to be studying. But I think that's well past. And it's now, especially with, scholars like John Garth with Tolkien and the Great War, Diana Glyer with the company they keep, opening up some fresh sort of avenues for the way that Tolkien related to his contemporaries and to the modern world. And then, with just so many exciting lines of inquiry about all different facets of Tolkien, and of course made possible by Christopher Tolkien's just epic work, bringing his father's papers to light. So there's a lot more that I wish we had. I wish we had even something remotely close to a complete letters. That was Walter Hooper's great gift to Lewis Studies, which I think opened up Lewis Studies tremendously to have the collected letters. I think if we could have that for Tolkien, it would be kind of a quantum leap forward in terms of our understanding. But we've done a lot, I think, in the last 2 decades, and especially the last decade, I think, to just open up lots of new lines of research. And I think it's really exciting field to be in.
Yeah, fantastic. And I do want to sort of ask you about the letters, but what do you think sort of the chances are of a more extensive volume, or perhaps volumes, ever seeing the light of day of Tolkien's letters? That is that something that might be on the horizon, or perhaps not?
I hope so. I have no knowledge. I have no knowledge of it.
No, for sure. Yeah.
One way or the other. But I hope so. I do. I think it would be a great gift to readers and to scholars. And yeah, and I think the time is becoming riper as people are realizing, I think, what a multidimensional thinker Tolkien was, that really there's a lot that we can glean from his letters, just as we could glean so much from Lewis's letters that just shed insight on his work, on his thinking. And if there's one thing that regarding that I came to the conclusion of after doing my research for Tolkien's modern reading, is that Tolkien is a genuinely good man with genuinely healthy relationships. And of course, every family has its difficulties and struggles. I mean, that's called being human. But I think that there's a new letters would not be from a sort of voyeuristic point of view of like, oh, let's see what skeletons might be in the closet. I don't think there are any skeletons. I think he had in many ways a very normal, ordinary life, which is really refreshing, frankly. But I think even things that seem pretty trivial to, conversations and letters can really shed a lot of light on creative inspiration and how he engaged with the modern world and how that sheds light on his writings. So I have no idea, but I am hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be it would be wonderful and would really complement so much of the scholarship that's already been done. So I suppose just briefly, and I know you've spoken about this in various other interviews, but what sort of motivated you, or how did you come to write this book in particular?
Well, this book took 10 years to write, so this is quite a labor of love. And it came about, you mentioned you called it a corrective, and I think that that's accurate. But I didn't set out to do that. It emerged out of my research. It was a discovery that startled me as much as it has startled any of the readers of the book.
Yep.
So I've been thinking seriously about Tolkien for more than 30 years, and writing about him, for a very long time. And one of the things I did my doctoral thesis on fantasy literature, and in that context, I had looked at the fantasy literature before Tolkien, and then at Tolkien's work, on his work. And one of the things that left me with, years later, I kept coming back to that and thinking, there were some interesting fantasy authors before Tolkien. I wonder if Tolkien had read any of them. And I knew that, he'd mentioned St. Morris, but I thought, I wonder how many of these authors had he read? And that tied in with another question, which was the persistent question of, why is Lord of the Rings just so popular? Why is it so meaningful to the modern world? Because if, as I thought at the time, Tolkien was primarily, exclusively a medievalist, it just seemed a little kind of puzzling that this total medievalist could write a book that speaks so profoundly to the heart of the modern world. And so those two questions ended up actually meeting, because I thought, let me find out what he read of his modern literature. And I honestly did not expect to find very much, because, Carpenter says in the biography, Tolkien read very little modern fiction and took no serious notice of it. And I believed him. He's the biographer. Like, why shouldn't I believe him?
Yep.
And so I just started looking, and I'm a methodical researcher. I look at everything when I do research. I try to leave no stone unturned, and I made a point of looking as much as possible at primary sources, at his letters, at his interviews, really digging deep in archives to look at, say, interviews that had not been reprinted, looking at interviews with his students, with his family, his friends, his colleagues, anybody who could shed light on anything Tolkien had ever said that showed what he had read. And again, I was being so thorough in part because I thought that there wouldn't be much to find, and so I would have to dig to find anything. And then I just kept finding more and more things that he read, and ended up with almost 150 different authors of 1850 onwards.
Yes.
More than 200 books that we know for sure that he knew, not speculating. And so that's what led to this book, because I actually started out thinking that I was, just going to do a little bit of exploration of his reading, and then maybe I would look at, what happened after him. And then I realized that I had way too much material to do that.
Yes.
And about halfway through that, I thought, good heavens, I have evidence that shows that he did read extensively in modern literature, Humphrey Carpenter was wrong. That's simply incorrect, factually incorrect. And that led me to go back and say, where did we get this mistaken picture? Why did we think that he didn't read modern literature? Here's the data. How do we account for it? And that's what I spent the last few years of the project working on, trying to figure out, how do we get this faulty picture? And then how do we put the pieces together in a way that gives us a more accurate, a more well-rounded picture?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and in that sense, I think the work is in part a sort of a work also of historiography and criticism in that sense, especially, of course, of Carpenter, who you've mentioned, but also the sort of I suppose the poisoning of the well that occurred when Carpenter's biography was released, and you have a nice discussion towards the end of the book about some of the critical perspectives that various scholars had on Tolkien prior to Carpenter's biography coming out, and sometimes there are comparisons to authors who nowadays we would think, oh, that's nothing like Tolkien, but who prior to Carpenter were sort of placed. He was placed in their company, so I found that fascinating, and hopefully we're moving back to that kind of back to that position, as you mentioned, at least to some degree.
Yeah, I hope so, because that to me was illuminating. To go back and to look at reception history and say, okay, well, what were people saying about Lord of the Rings shortly after it was published? What were they saying before the biography, before the Inklings group study, even before the collected letters came out? And yeah, it was startling to see how readily people placed him alongside authors like Eliot's or other modern authors. Readily, without second guessing themselves, without being kind of apologetic about it. They just put him right next to those authors. Mm-hmm. And that was really striking to me, because as soon as you get the biography and the Inklings group biography, those two together were kind of a 1-2.
Yes. Yep.
That pretty much stops. And when you do continue to get scholars who notice his reading of modern literature, because that's notable, because there's a lot of quite good work that can make the connections. I mean, my bibliography is something like 10,000 words.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good work. But interestingly, after Carpenter's volumes came out, pretty much all of these scholars, they're all convinced that they've got an exception. Well, he didn't like modern literature except this one thing, or he didn't engage with modern culture except in this one way. So we've got all these people who have genuinely good insights. They're making really important connections, but they all think it's an exception to the rule. And what I realize is there is no rule. There is no rule. How with that? It's all part of a bigger picture. Yes, he was a definite medievalist, but he also had a real connection with the modern world. And that's a meaningful part. And all of these different scholars who have insights, very good insights about his engagement with modern literature, all of that has much more impact when you put it together and say, it's not an exception, folks. It's part of a three-dimensional picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes through in your book. Just on Carpenter, you've mentioned his sort of Inklings biography, and I did read that quite a few years ago, and I seem to recall him in that book sort of essentially making up a sort of a hypothetical Inklings meeting, or perhaps a couple of them. I don't know, what's your sort of take on that particular book? Is that as misleading as the Tolkien, the singular Tolkien biography, or does that have merits, do you think, or is that ripe to be superseded as well?
It's also deeply flawed. Interestingly, that book has been superseded in Lewis studies, I think, much more readily. It has had a negative effect on Lewis studies as well, because he says some very silly things about Lewis, and he he presents a picture of the Inklings, and Diana Glyer goes into this really well in her book, The Company They Keep.
Yes.
He had a really depressing effect, a flattening effect on studies of the Inklings as a group, because Carpenter just says, oh, they did not influence each other, period. No, they didn't. And Glyer proves through looking at the manuscripts, looking at all sorts of archival data, that Carpenter was simply incorrect. They did influence each other in really significant ways. And her work was actually quite influential on my work in showing me, in a way, that there was a need for a fresh looking at this evidence. So yeah, Carpenter's perspective, interestingly, his reconstruction of the Inklings meeting is I think fairly accurate from what I know of
right,
the data. but that seems to be a bit of an exception. And part of, I think, why that particular bit works is that he's actually upfront about it. And he says, this is a reconstruction. It's imagined.
Yes.
A lot of the problem with both of the books as a whole is that he puts in a lot of his own interpretation as if it were just statements of fact. So we get his reading of things. So, for instance, his presentation of Tolkien's view on Narnia, which is partly in the biography and partly in the group biography of the Inklings. I mean, he is so off base on that it's not even funny. And when you look at it, it's almost completely his interpretation presented as if it were stone cold fact, when it's not.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know if you've read very much. This question has occurred to me because I'm just interested in terms of that Inklings, the book that Carpenter wrote. I don't know if you've sort of read much Charles Williams and some of the other Inklings, but do you think some of a lot, right? Yeah. Have they also been sort of negatively? You've mentioned Lewis, and Lewis studies sort of being flattened somewhat by that book. But do you think that's also been the case with some of the other, especially the imaginative writers like Williams, as well? Or?
I think a little bit less so, because I think Carpenter just doesn't take as much notice of them. So they're somewhat sidelined in the group biography, and so they sort of escape getting misrepresented by being less attended to, which is faint praise, I think.
yeah, for sure. No, that's interesting. Yeah, so
but actually, I would add that I think in a way, Carpenter's framing of the Inklings as being so dominantly around Lewis has perhaps skewed it a little bit, because the Inklings was quite a large group, all things considered, and I do think we've kind of missed out, the contributions of Warren Lewis, for instance. I mean, he was a published writer of quite substantial merit, and you kind of wouldn't know that from a lot of the considerations of the Inklings, and Barfield and Williams and all the other crew who were members of the Inklings on a regular basis. So in a way, I think part of that overall distorting effect, not just by Carpenter, but by lots of people, to just zero in on Lewis and Tolkien, it does distort the picture slightly, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I do recall a book from a few years back called The Fellowship. I'm not sure if you've read that, but that sort of like the Carpenter Inklings book seems to take a similar approach. I don't know if I remember enjoying that book, and certainly feeling that it was less singularly focused on Tolkien and Lewis, and sort of gave more space to some of those other writers, especially Charles Williams, and I think there's quite a lot on Owen Barfield. I don't know if that sort of thing, or if that book in particular, sort of helps correct things in your mind. But I certainly remember.
It's by the Zalewski's, Philip Zalewski, and it's a good book. It's a solid book. They do follow Carpenter a little bit too closely in a few points. They repeat his idea about Narnia incorrectly, but they do, as you just noted, they do give a lot of emphasis to Williams and Barfield, and that's an important corrective. I mean, there's hardly any treatment of the Inklings that gives a decent consideration to Barfield, and that's it's important. And their treatment of Williams is probably the most accurate of the multi-volume ones. Greville Lindup's one volume biography of Williams is magisterial. It's the go-to. It's quite unsettling, really. But the Fellowship I think is probably the best single volume book on the Inklings that there is.
It almost made me want to go and read Williams, but I haven't got around to it yet. So maybe one day. But he seems quite well. His reputation is that he is a quite obscure writer. But I suppose I need to get into him a bit more to try it for myself. But just I suppose getting back to Tolkien studies and then Carpenter's effect on that. I mean, a lot of comparatively recent sort of books on Tolkien studies. For example, Tom Shippey's books, although I suppose they're nearly 20 years old now, take quite a defensive posture, towards Tolkien's critics. Do you think some of that comes out of I suppose this sense that Carpenter creates that you note that Tolkien sort of has somehow lacks a connection or interest in the modern world, and that is part of that defensiveness a little bit, or do you think something else is motivating that sentiment?
I think that's a very apt description of the scholarship of, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And I think it is. I mean, Shippey's work is amazing. Those books are just really important, but they are over now. They're not recent books. And I think that a couple of things going on. And one of them is that, all the way even through, I would say, the 1980s for sure, fantasy scholarship in general had a defensive, and you see it in all the monographs. And it's an overall sense of having to defend the legitimacy of talking about fantasy of anybody in any form. And that, I think it lingered on a good bit, and even beyond the 1980s into, further into Tolkien scholarship. Fortunately, that, I think, in the last, couple of decades has eased. I don't see that defensive tone anymore. And I think that's part of the big step forward in the field. So I think that's partly an ebbing in general. But I think Tolkien studies probably stayed with that defensive tone a little longer than fantasy scholarship in general, which, around like the 90s was probably becoming a little bit less defensive. And I think you're probably right that Carpenter's pretty definitive painting of Tolkien as, backward-looking, nostalgic, disconnected from the modern world. If that's your author, it does make you feel a bit defensive when you're trying to talk about his relevance. So I do think that probably contributed to, and honestly, to a kind of self-perpetuating defensiveness. Because the more people talk about him as being this nostalgic, stuck in the mud guy, the more people feel the need to defend that, well, I'm still going to talk about this guy, but he wasn't. He wasn't.
Yeah. I'm interested in nostalgia, this concept. I don't know if you've listened to lectures by, for example, Michael Drought or a few other scholars, but they've made the argument, and I tend to agree, that nostalgia is indeed a kind of central, and I think you do talk about this in your book, is a kind of central emotion or sentiment, if you like, in The Lord of the Rings, for example. So I know Michael Drought has made the argument that, well, we shouldn't devalue nostalgia so much. We shouldn't just cede that ground to modernists, or, at least modern people, and say, well, the only kinds of attitudes to have about modernity are, that we accept it, that we embrace it. So what's your take on nostalgia in The Lord of the Rings in a kind of general sense?
Well, I think that's a really good insight from Drought on that. Because, I would agree that there is a profoundly nostalgic thread in The Lord of the Rings. If we define nostalgia as the looking backward to a lost past that was better than what we have now.
Mm.
And that's legitimate, because there are times when you do look back at a lost past and it was better than what you have now. And honestly, part of the experience is, as you grow older, I'm middle aged now, and when my back is sort of creaking, I might become a little bit nostalgic for when I was in my 20s and nothing creaked, and this is actually part of the human experience. And I think it's interesting to know, and this is something I turned up in reading for Tolkien's modern reading, is that a lot of the 20th century authors who are quite revered by modern critics also have nostalgic elements. Graham Greene, Yves Lenoir, Edith Nesbit, lots of people, and for good reason, because in the 20th century, especially 20th century Britain, where in this context, you've got a lot of disruption. The Industrial Revolution, going further back, the Industrial Revolution, the enclosures of the commons, had a profoundly traumatic effect on the rural landscape and on people's lives. And then if you think about, the First World War, you think about the Second World War, and I think for Americans, at least, we sometimes miss the point that, it was a lot harder for the British, going through these experiences than for Americans. We as a country sent our young men over to fight, but not as many, and it didn't have as quite of a personal connection, a personal devastation as it did on England, and obviously on other countries of Europe who were involved. But
yes.
So I think there's a sense in which Tolkien's nostalgia is realistic, if we can use that paradox. And I would dispute. I think I would share Drought's skepticism about accepting. I would dispute this idea that irony and parody are the only appropriate modes for engaging with the modern world. Yep. Now they're the dominant modes after the two world wars, but why should we concede that ground to the modernists? And Tolkien's not willing to do that. And I think it's one of the great triumphs of The Lord of the Rings that it manages to have. It's what Lewis calls, I think he calls it the clear-eyed view, between nostalgia and despair. I'm mangling that quote slightly, but he gets the middle ground because he does actually look at destruction and despair quite straightforwardly. I mean, think about Denethor setting himself on fire. You think about the fact that the Shire does not escape the touch of Mordor. I mean, one of the most, I think, moving parts of The Lord of the Rings is, and the part that is, I think, the repulse to anybody who claims that the book is, simply a wishful thinking, nostalgic exercise. Frodo and Sam and the others are always looking back to when we get back to the Shire, we're stuck in Mordor. When we get back to the Shire, they have a sort of nostalgic vision of the beauty of the Shire that helps sustain them. And then they get back to the Shire, and the party tree has been cut down. It's full of horrible people doing horrible things. It's almost a violation, and it's utterly realistic in a sense, and it sort of subverts easy ideas about what nostalgia means. He's got a profound realism, I think, at the same time that he has a recognition of nostalgia.
Yeah, fantastic. Just, I suppose, turning to that idea of realism, which of course you discuss in your book, and also historical fiction. You mentioned a few authors like Mary Renaud, for example, whose Alexander books I've read, and you mentioned that Tolkien seems to have had a positive sort of reaction to these, and also other books of historical fiction and realism. I suppose, how do you think about Tolkien's reading of historical and realist fiction of the 20th century, Mary Renaud, for example, and do you think these were, I suppose, influential on his own fiction or thinking about fiction, or were they more sort of enjoyment for him, I guess?
Well, I think, well, in a way, I would first say that those two things aren't quite separable.
No, true. Yes.
And whatever he's reading, if he's reading it, he values it, and if he
Mm,
values it, then it says something about his creative imagination, and
mm.
that's one of the things that I think, everything is connected in a sense. So even though we know that he liked Renaud's fiction, he was delighted to get a fan letter from her.
Mm.
So we know that he liked these. He names a couple of her books as being ones that he particularly enjoyed. Um, what did he draw from those particular ones? We don't know,
Mm.
but
Mm.
we do know, for instance, that he said that he read all of the works of Sinclair Lewis,
Mm.
who was an American realist. And in a way, that might have been one of the biggest surprises for me, because I hadn't read Sinclair Lewis, but I made a point of trying to read everything that Tolkien said that he read, not
Yep.
just to name the book, but to go and read it. And sometimes this was great pleasure, and sometimes it was not so much a pleasure.
Mm.
And Sinclair Lewis is not to my taste, but he was evidently to Tolkien's taste. And he's a satirist. He's a realist, and he's satirizing American small town life. Of all the things that I can imagine Tolkien enjoying so much is to read multiple books of satire of American small town life. Really? But he does. And he goes on, and we know this influenced him, because he says that there's a connection between Babbitt, the character in the book of that name, and hobbits. That first there's a slight sound connection, but then he goes on to say that they have the same worldview, a sort of smug bourgeois worldview, and that to me says that he is drawing from what he's reading in modern literature, because he's able to see in this protagonist of an American realist satirist novel quite a deep character level connection with his hobbits. That's fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was fascinated to read about. I mean, I was surprised as well. Some of Tolkien's readerly interests were quite surprising to me as well, including his love of sort of Agatha Christie and some of those other the crime fiction stuff was interesting. But one other area that you look at in some detail is, and there's a lot in the book. I'll just say there's so many areas of focus, but one in particular that I'm interested in is Tolkien as a Catholic writer, and I suppose, as I understand it, in terms of imaginative writers or novelists at any rate during the 20th century, there are quite a few well-known, I guess you would call them realist novelists, Evil and War, for example, who you mentioned, Graham Greene you've mentioned. How do you think, I suppose, as a thinker and perhaps also as a novelist per se, Tolkien fits into the sort of Catholic tradition in the 20th century? Obviously, he's a fantasy writer, but is there a sort of a deeper connection in that specifically, I guess, religious or philosophical sense?
Well, that's a difficult question to tease out. I think, I would say certainly that there is a connection, because Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and he's very clear that he is expressing his faith in the sort of very structure of what he's writing, at a pretty fundamental level. That when he talks about Iluvatar, the one, he means God. He means the same God that he worships. That's a pretty profound connection, really. That he sees a continuity, between his imagined secondary world and the primary world. But he's also very subtle. And I'm a bit sort of fed up sometimes with writers who try to make the Lord of the Rings into a sort of gospel tract, by saying these are all the, A equals B, and here it's an evangelizing tract. Well, it's not. It's very deeply Catholic, and it's full of religious themes. But Tolkien himself says that they come through in the symbolism, not explicitly.
Mm.
He's doing it at a deep level, and that's how he wants to communicate. And this this idea of implicit Catholicism, I think, is in line with the sort of 20th century Catholic literary approach. This isn't a line that I've explored too much. This is actually something I'm looking at in my next Tolkien book. I'm actually working on a book on his faith. So stay tuned, for that.
Yep.
But I do think it is consistent with the larger sort of approach of Catholic novelists, taking into account that a number of the Catholic novelists that you mentioned were sort of struggling to actually be Catholic. They were in and out. They were borderline. And Tolkien always was in. He stayed firm, very consciously firm in his faith. So we're not quite comparing apples to apples, but I think there is a consistency.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I guess, overly familiar with the lives of many of these other authors, but yeah, that's a great point. It's very interesting. You mentioned the Silmarillion there, or a few elements from the Silmarillion, Iluvatar, etc. And in the book, in your book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, you obviously restrict yourself mostly to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which is completely understandable. But what's your take on, I guess, the Silmarillion and how it fits in with, I guess, Tolkien's better known works, if it fits at all? It's obviously quite an idiosyncratic text. But what's your wider take on the Silmarillion? I'd just be interested to know.
Yeah, it's interesting because in a way, the Silmarillion is what Tolkien would have called his life's work. I mean, and so the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits are almost accidental, providential accidents, I would say. I'm quite grateful that they happened that way. But he always viewed the larger epic of the Silmarillion as his big project, as his life's work. And then, first, the Hobbit has its independent existence and then becomes kind of drawn into the orbit of the Silmarillion. And then the Lord of the Rings emerges from that larger mythology and is connected to it. And I think that the Lord of the Rings would not be what it is if it didn't come out of the Silmarillion, because so much of the depth of it is from the way that he references the songs, the poetry, the references to history. Even though they're not explained in the text, there's a resonance to it that I think you can tell that there's something there. There's depth. It's not just a flat stage set. There's a whole a whole universe beyond that. And I think that, not to mention the languages, I think that is part of what makes the Lord of the Rings just literally inimitable, because he does something so astonishing. He creates an entire universe of languages that actually work, mind you, not not just a glossary of funny made up words. But he was a linguist. He created languages. He took them through their stages of linguistic evolution according to the laws of phonology. I mean, that's mind-boggling. It really is. The amount of genius operating in Tolkien is just off the charts. And so we have this depth, and I think that we owe a great deal to the Silmarillion, even if it's only for what it gives to the Lord of the Rings and backwardly, in hindsight, to the Hobbits.
Right. Yeah.
And I had a hard time getting into the Silmarillion. I mean, I loved the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit from the instant I read them. And the Silmarillion, it took me a bit. it was not instant love, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But I come increasingly to realize what substance we have. And of course, the agonizing thing is that we talk about the Silmarillion, what are we actually talking about? And one of the difficulties in writing in Tolkien's Modern Reading is that there's the published Silmarillion, which was collected and assembled by Christopher Tolkien and had to involve quite a lot of editing and combining. Okay, so that's not exactly that's not the book that Tolkien envisioned. When Tolkien said the Silmarillion, he wasn't thinking of the book that we now can buy in the bookshop called the Silmarillion. And then there's the whole legendarium of all of the texts, including the ones that he wrote like 27 different versions and never finished any of them. Oh my word. Why did you do this to us? So there's quite a lot there. And now, I think it's really a really wonderful thing that we've got, the massive history of Middle Earth. We have all of these materials meticulously put together, absolute treasure trove for scholars, not exactly readable for readers. I think it's really wonderful that Christopher, managed to also pull out some individual volumes in addition to the Silmarillion. So we have Beren and Luthien. So we have, the Fall of Gondolin. And again, they're adaptations and pulling things together of his father's work, but they managed to give us something closer, I think, to what his father was envisioning as the Silmarillion. And they're beautiful. You've got to put your head into a different place. So this is not the Lord of the Rings, part 2. This is something completely different. And this was actually something that struck me when I was writing Tolkien's Modern Reading, is that part of the reason, I think, that we often, many people, I think not just myself, find the Silmarillion a little bit hard going, is that Lord of the Rings has so conditioned our expectations for fantasy that we don't kind of know what to expect. But then I was really fascinated to read Lord Dunsany and to see how popular Dunsany's Tales of Begana were. And that, in many ways, is remarkably similar to the Silmarillion in what he was doing in his mythology. I mean, not anything like as complex, but it's in the ballpark. And that was hugely popular. People read it. It had major reviews in the Times. It was a big deal. We don't think about that today because it's all been, past and we don't, it's not popular now. But if you go back to Tolkien's time, when he was trying to get the Silmarillion published, he could point to Dunsany, who had been published by, the same publishing family that he was now working with. And that was somebody who was doing something not totally dissimilar that had been hugely popular. So I think that if the Silmarillion, this is hypothetical, but if the Silmarillion had been published when Tolkien wanted it to be published, I think the readership of the time would have got it much more than they did when Christopher brought it out.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And do you think that situation is changing a bit, especially with the release of with these sort of great tales volumes, which collect some of that history of Middle Earth material and unfinished tales material, and sort of package it much more in a much more accessible form? For example, the Children of Húrin, which is more or less a readable, start to finish novel. The other ones, unfortunately, are not, simply because Tolkien did not, of course, write quite enough, but they're still more accessible than, for example, trying to plunge into the history of Middle Earth, and perhaps more accessible to some extent than just reading the Silmarillion as well. I don't know what you'd think about that, but
yeah, I mean, I think so. I think in a way, I commend. I think some people are for some reason annoyed at the publication of these many different poems, and I say, if you don't like them, don't buy them and don't read them. It's really that simple. I think they're really doing a great service because they do offer different entry points in. And Tolkien himself conceived his legendarium as being big, vast. So I think it is helping kind of almost to win back the context that got lost, between the 30s and, the 80s, basically, and helping people almost develop a taste for it. And I think that's great because it's really, really good stuff. And I personally think that, if we can attribute any flaw to the Lord of the Rings, it's almost that it was too good because it had such almost a black hole gravitational effect on all other fantasy for decades. We get so much imitation, and much of it is just so wretched.
Yeah. Yeah.
That it had an effect. Now it's coming out of it. There's lots of
Mm,
different kinds of fantasy now.
mm,
And I think
mm,
that's great.
mm.
And in part, it helps us to finally appreciate Tolkien again for what he is and not for all of the sort
Yeah.
of medieval, imitations of him. And now I think we've got a place where people maybe are ready to appreciate the kind of diversity of his imaginative vision.
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful observation, and just put me in mind of the Game of Thrones phenomenon, and then of course I remember as the TV show was coming out, obviously the books first, well, not finished, of course, but um, when the TV show was first coming out, I remember reading quite a few articles online about how Martin has surpassed Tolkien, Martin has replaced Tolkien. There was even one saying, "Well, we should forget about Tolkien and Martin's the new thing." That moment seems to have passed. I don't see those sorts of articles anymore. But yeah, I'd be interested in your take on sort of. You mentioned a lot of imitative fantasy, which is true, but then you also get this reaction against Tolkien for, well, perceived at least political reasons or perhaps religious reasons or for other reasons. Of course, Michael Moorcock being a famous example, but also Martin himself to an extent. I mean, he says what I consider quite silly things about Tolkien's fiction, which betray a complete misunderstanding, like, well, we don't know anything about Aragorn's tax policy, for example, as though that were something that was salient to understanding what Tolkien is doing. It says this completely, with a straight face, apparently. But my feeling is that that the moment for sort of Martin's grimdark fiction take on fantasy is sort of past. I'm not sure what you would, if you would agree with that, but it certainly seems like Tolkien is, as you mentioned, perhaps coming back into the zeitgeist a little bit.
Yeah, and I hope you're right that Martin Grimdark moment is passing. I think it has an expiration date, and if it isn't already past, it will pass.
Mm, mm,
And the reason I think that is that ultimately the whole Game of Thrones thing is actually also deeply imitative of Tolkien. It's
mm,
imitative of by opposing him,
mm, mm,
because it's
mm.
basically saying everything that Tolkien believes. I'm going to take a medieval-ish setting. I'm going to take the trappings of Tolkien, which are the least important part, and
Mm.
I'm going to, within those trappings, I'm going to try and tell a story that has all the things that are opposite to Tolkien. Tolkien, has his characters be sort of chaste and respectful. I will have sex, explicit
Yeah.
sex. And it's silly to say that there's no sex in Tolkien's books
Mm.
because his characters have children. They marry, they have children. There's
Yeah.
obviously, but he's restrained about how he puts it in.
Mm, mm.
His restraint is not a sort of Martin-esque virtue.
No.
And and even more fundamentally, Tolkien's world is one that has objective morality. It's a one in which goodness and evil, more complex than some critics would say, but that they're real,
It's
they're
there.
meaningful. And and I think in Martin's world, it's trying to be the opposite. Well, what do we have if we have a world of moral relativism? And and I think so ultimately, Game of Thrones is kind of an anti-Tolkien.
Mm.
And I, in the same way that Philip Pullman's Amber Spyglass books are an anti-Narnia. And I think for the exact same reason, although both of them are, competent writers, sometimes good writers, at various points,
Mm.
I think that neither Pullman nor Martin will ultimately be read in 100 years. And, except by people doing doctoral dissertations.
Mm.
And, and Tolkien and Lewis will be, because they're not reacting to a particular moment. They're speaking, more timelessly. And part of being timeless is actually, Tolkien is timeless not because he's rejecting the modern world, but because he sees it, he sees the past, and he partakes of both, and he does his own thing. And I think that kind of, you know, that kind of timelessness is one that isn't reactionary at all. And I think Martin is much more reactionary than Tolkien in that respect.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Well, I hope that's right too. I must say, I have read the books up to where they are, the Martin's books, but I don't think I'm going to be very motivated to finish off that series if it ever does actually get completed, which at the moment is still up in the air, as it were.
That might be
But
the
I
most
guess,
Tolkienian thing.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I guess just to finish off, I wanted to bring it back around to something you write in the book, or a discussion that you present around the Romans, and Tolkien's views of the Romans. And I want to bring this up because being an archaeologist, I've studied Roman archaeology, and this particular part of the book was obviously very interesting. And you sort of make the case that the Romans are perhaps one inspiration, one part of Tolkien's inspiration for the orcs and the sort of rapaciousness of Mordor and Sauron's civilization. So I wonder if you could just sort of speak to that a little bit, and also, and you link that to William Morris's own perspective of the Romans. So I'm wondering, how important you think that influence is on Tolkien's development of the orcs and Mordor more generally. But I'm also curious about, and I know you don't talk too much about the Númenóreans in the book, but there is a sort of in some of Tolkien's Second Age material, there is development of, for example, Eldarion and Arendis in Unfinished Tales, this idea that the Númenóreans become gradually morally bankrupt as they become more imperially ambitious. So I'm wondering if you might see some connection with the Romans there as well. But I mean, long question, but yeah, I was just very interested in that discussion.
Well, this to me was a really a fascinating puzzle with this, and my suggestion of a connection between the orcs and the Romans is just that it's a venturing of an idea. And, I would like it to be picked up and to see if other people can run with it, because if it actually is if I've discerned a true connection, then it should bear fruit in being able to better understand what Tolkien's doing in his work and how this sheds light on it. I think it is a good connection. And what got me started on that was this very puzzling remark that Tolkien makes, this is often quoted, which is that he says that the Lord of the Rings owes more to William Morris and to his Huns and his Romans, as in the House of the Wolfings or the Roots of the Mountains, than it does to the landscape of the Somme. And the connection between the Lord of the Rings and the Great War landscape is something that is definitely, a real connection. It's been very fruitfully explored by lots of scholars. But it fascinated me to see how seldom anybody paid any attention to the other half of the quote, where he talks about his debt to William Morris and his Huns and Romans. Now, the interpretation of what he means by that remark is debated, and I enter into that a little bit. And there are some different legitimate ways to interpret that. Exactly what was he pointing to? Was it general influence or was it the landscape? But actually, either way that you interpret it, whether you're talking about the scope overall of the Lord of the Rings or you're talking about the landscape, either way, he draws a direct connection between the Lord of the Rings and William Morris and his Huns and his Romans in those two books. And I just thought, well, that's interesting. And then read these two books, and I was really struck by the fact that, the Romans, I tend to think of the ancient Romans as, Caesar and his legions, and they're, they magically kind of clean cut, Roman roads, etc. Cleopatra, slightly romantic, sorts of things. Well, in William Morris's House of the Wolfings in particular, the Romans are a thoroughly bad lot. It's the quote unquote barbarians who are the good guys, fighting off these corrupt invaders from the south, of Europe. And it just struck me that the language that Morris uses to physically describe and morally describe the Romans is orcish. I mean, there are so many parallels between the kinds of adjectives and phrasings and characteristics of Morris's Romans in the House of the Wolfings and the orcs. And then tracing out interesting little things like just various references, maps and different comments, when it becomes clear that when Tolkien says that Mordor is in the south, he doesn't mean the global south. He means the south of Europe. It's in the area, more or less, of Italy. And that's really interesting. For one thing, that does complicate the assumptions that people often make about his supposed, racist or colonialist views that the orcs are from the south of Middle Earth. They must therefore be associated with, people from the global south. Well, no, actually, they seem to be associated with Italians. And then in other letters, Tolkien, he speaks very harshly of the Romans. He says that he would have been on the side of Carthage, the North Africans. He would have been on Carthage's side, not the Roman side. That's remarkable. So all these things together started me thinking that, Mordor is based, if we were to map it onto the earth, as he did actually, he talks about that where it is, mapped onto our map, and it's in Italy basically. And so I think this gives a sort of a richer insight into his negative portrayal of the orcs. It puts it in a different context. It puts it in a different historical context because he's writing The Lord of the Rings during the Second World War, when you have Mussolini and fascist Italy being quite a problem. His son is fighting in Africa against fascist Italy. Tolkien's very anti-totalitarian. He's really very against all forms of imperial domination. And then if you think about the literary connection, if he's mediating his orcs through Morris's Romans, they're not anymore drawn so much from any particular, human race. They're drawn from a really complex mix of ancient history and literature. So it makes the picture of the orcs much more interesting. And I think it also helps us understand the fact that Tolkien himself never quite figured out what to make of his orcs. He's till the very end of his life, he's puzzling over the question of, are the orcs, are they persons? Do they have free will? He thinks probably not. But what actually are they? Were they made? Were they corrupted? He can never quite figure them out, and he doesn't have this problem with any of the other races of Middle Earth. It's quite clear where all of them come from. Imagine speaking in Middle Earth, but the orcs are always kind of problematic, and I think that this is perhaps slightly more understandable if you think that their imaginative genesis came via William Morris, because he almost got the image, has these orcs, and then kind of after the fact maybe realizes, they don't quite fit properly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think I found your discussion quite convincing, so it'd be fascinating to see that theme sort of taken up and explored more. Even their physical sort of descriptions of Morris's Romans bear quite a few similarities to those of Tolkien's orcs, which you observe, which is interesting. So hopefully that's something that'll be taken up, because of course when talking about the Romans in relation to Middle Earth, it's usually Gondor that's mentioned as a kind of, and certainly the films take this up, that Gondor is kind of representative of the Romans in the story. But I think you make a good case that it's a bit more complex than that.
And I think this represents really the way that Tolkien's creative imagination worked, because he didn't take things pat. anytime we were suspecting to think that he took X from X source and put it into Middle Earth, we're probably wrong. Because he draws from his sources, but even when he acknowledges a source, that he might also acknowledge other sources, like with the Hobbits. He acknowledges E.A. Wick Smith's The Marvelous Land of Smurgs and Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. You couldn't really get much more different than those two. So I think if anything comes out of, for instance, looking at this Roman question, I think it would be to kind of complicate the assumptions that we very easily make as readers, as critics, and I include myself. It's very easy to draw conclusions. Oh, I see this similarity, therefore that's where he got it from. Well, maybe he got it from there and 5 other places. And to what extent were these influences mediated through other influences? It becomes quite a lot more complex and more interesting.
Yeah, and of course, source studies have long been sort of a staple of Tolkien scholarship, and you mentioned a couple of instances in the book where where source studies have not been successful, to put it mildly. Do you think that that's getting more sophisticated nowadays? I mean, even Tom Shippey, of course, is known for Tolkien's medieval source, or for looking at Tolkien's medieval sources in a lot of depth. But do you think that's getting more sophisticated, even in terms of the medieval side of things, or is there still a bit of learning to do, I guess, on the part of scholars and sources?
Well, I think in terms of Tolkien studies overall, I think we're hugely advanced over past years, and there's been such good work. And there's been some really good sort of meta-reflective work on sources, like Jason Fisher's work on Tolkien sources, excellent volume. There's a number, Fisher and others, doing really thoughtful considerations of the way that Tolkien uses his sources, both medieval and well, hopefully I'll contribute to the modern bit. And I think that is a huge advance. And partly, I think, the medieval side of Tolkien scholarship has really flourished. There's so much good work, really insightful work on the way that Tolkien uses his medieval sources. And I think that one of the ways that's been so fruitful is that people are no longer able to draw the simplistic conclusions because they're seeing the depth and the range of Tolkien's medieval reading and how the different sources interact. And it makes you realize, okay, I can't draw these direct connections for his medieval sources. My argument is, well, you can't do that with his modern sources either. These are also much more rich and varied and full, and there's a lot going on here. So I think we've made a lot of progress. Now, I do think that in the sort of more popular level scholarship or more popular level writing, maybe done by people who aren't actually Tolkien specialists, but maybe have read, 1 or 2 books and are excited about Tolkien, you do still get a fair bit of, kind of simplistic source study because it's so tempting. It's so easy. And so we're probably always going to have that problem.
Sure.
But I think as a discipline, I think Tolkien studies has faced up to the problems of it. Good and healthy way. And yeah, I had to, because there's some critics who have some quite scathing things to say about source study. And you know what? They're often right. There's some really wretched source studies out there. I think a few of them in my footnotes.
Yes.
And so I had to really grapple with that because I had to say, what kind of work am I doing? I'm doing, in effect, a source study, but I want to do it properly. How am I going to engage with it? And so I always set out to try to have this sort of complex view of influence and to see what was in front of me and not project onto it. And that's what I've tried to do, and to try to see the different ways that influence operates, sources versus influences, influences by example or influences by opposition, the different ways that Tolkien uses his sources. There's a lot of variety there that I think is important to kind of bear in mind under that larger category of source study.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as I mentioned, your book is a great entry into that genre. amongst many other things, it's great source study. So, and I think the complexity of influence, that notion really comes through. So I think that's a good place to draw things to a close. So, so I suppose, Holly, just in closing out, where can people sort of find you online? And I know the book's available it is available directly from the publisher, but also, of course, on Amazon as well. So where can people find you if they're interested in other interviews? And I know you've done quite a few, and podcasts and things like that.
Well, I have a website, which is hollyordway.com. Pretty straightforward. And I also I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and that's where I put a lot of you can search me there, and that's where I share a lot of these links. And then as far as getting the book, obviously you can get it through, retailers like Amazon. They're a little frustrating to deal with sometimes. And I do know that actually not just in the US, but also in Europe and in Australia, you can get it directly from the publisher. The Word on Fire store does have an Australia store and a Europe store and a US store. And if you go to wordonfire.org/Tolkien, that has the link for where you can go. And that also has a couple of interviews that I've done on the book. And it also has the whole selection of a number of videos that I did on location in England, talking about Tolkien's modern reading, actually at places that Tolkien lived and worked and grew up, which was great. They're great fun to do. So if anybody's interested in seeing Tolkien's context in the videos, they're also on that site.
Oh, wonderful! Just out of interest, were you able to get to Oxford to see the exhibition at the Bodleian on Tolkien a couple of years back?
Yes. I go to England. I typically go to England every year or twice a year.
Wonderful.
And I have done for like the last more than a decade, actually. And I was very, very glad to have been able to go to the Bodleian exhibition, which was fantastic. It was really fantastic.
Yeah, it was good. I was able to go there myself, actually, which was a much longer flight from here, but it was great. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and no, it was just such a well put together exhibition. I thought I was really impressed. But look, thank you so much for coming on. That was really fascinating, and just lovely to talk to you. So, I wish you all the best for the future, and the next book sounds interesting, so I'll be looking out for that as well. And I assume that'll be published by the same press?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Well, as soon as that comes out, I will get that and dive in. Well, thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
All right. Thank you. This has been a real pleasure. So thank you for having me on.
No worries at all. All right. Thanks.